Is war about winning and losing, or is it about making money? One has to actually ask that question, unfortunately, because there are some words coming out of some of the senior people in Washington, D.C., some inside, some outside the administration, which makes one wonder just what the objective actually is. Maybe everybody's not on the same sheet of music here. It's also a question we have to ask of our European partners, because what seems to be caught in the middle is the Ukrainian people, because they have one objective and others seem to have their own. And we're going to see how all that's going to work together. And then, of course, you have to add into the mix what the Russians want out of all this, too. And you see a real big, complicated mess that's brewing right now, as we now have President Donald Trump has taken the reins here almost a weekend. And man, this is a lot happening so far. We have Colonel Jacques Baud back with us today, one of our favorite guests on our show here, a former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, also former NATO officer. Colonel, as always, what a delight to have you back on today.
Thank you for having me back to the show. Thank you.
Well, and as we were talking about just before we came on air here, it's like something new is happening every day, and of course, it's always an interesting time with President Trump, because you never know what he's going to say. And I just kind of wonder what your view are, even before we get into some of the specifics here about what we're going to talk about. What is your view of the change in dynamics with Trump in office as opposed to Joe Biden?
Well, the first thing is that my feeling is that nobody, neither Trump nor Biden or others, do have an idea of how this conflict should stop. And what is, in fact, they don't have any exit strategy. And that applies to the US, that applies to the Europeans, certainly to the Europeans, probably a little bit less to the US. I mean, my view is that Donald Trump has a better view than Biden had, in the sense that for the Trump administration, I live for Donald Trump, the idea is to get out of this mess. They don't really care about what is the outcome for Ukraine or for Russia. They just want to get out of this. And that makes, in fact, the whole thing a little bit shaky, because nobody knows exactly what they want to do. We see that, and we see the so-called ultimatum that Trump gave to in fact, to both Zelensky and Putin. On the one hand, he said he wanted to settle the whole thing within 100 days or something like that. And he made a freeze, or he ordered a freeze of aid to, I mean,
right,
not the old projects. And apparently this doesn't apply to the aid that was already planned and prepared for Ukraine, especially military aid, but it applies to every new project. And that means that for Ukraine, they have kind of a red flag or orange flag, let's say, saying that you have to find a solution, otherwise you will have there will be no funding for you anymore.
right.
And he gave almost a similar type, I mean, not exactly the same, but it was also an ultimatum to Putin, saying, now you have to find a solution, otherwise, despite the fact that I love Russia, I love the Russian people, and we appreciate the sacrifice of the he even mentioned the 60 million, which is a bit exaggerated. But anyway, he said, despite the fact that I love Russia, I will have to apply new sanctions, tariffs, and taxes on Russia if you don't find a solution for the conflict. So, meaning that, in fact, he gave an ultimatum to both parties to find a solution. And that's interesting, because that shows that he has no solution. He is trying to force the two parties to go to the negotiation table and to find by themselves a solution. which is per se not completely wrong, because at the end of the day, the solution must be accepted by both parties. But this will not be satisfying for the Russians, because the Russians do not consider that the Ukrainians can provide a solution. And in fact, Zelensky has never came up with a sound solution. He came with his victory plan, which is in essence asking Russia to capitulate and withdraw
Right.
from
Yeah.
everything.
His idea is say, hey, Russia, why don't you just quit and surrender? Let me have what I want.
Danny,
Exactly.
we got to adjust. Danny, we have to adjust your mic. So let's just talk to me and let's get it right.
Is this that's almost all the way
Mine
down.
too.
No, you're Colonel.
Okay.
You're doing great. We just need to fix Danny's.
How about that, Gary? Is that
keep talking for me?
Yeah, is that doing anything? Is that helping?
Try your other one, and then.
Okay. Well, how about that?
There.
Right there.
Okay.
Keep
talking to me.
All right. How about that? Is that going to work?
A little hot. Turn it down. It's a little bit hot.
Yeah, sorry, it didn't. How about that? Is that any better?
I'll let you know when.
Oh boy, goodness gracious. Okay, we're almost all the way at the end of that now. That's all I got. I guess I'm just going to move the mic further back.
Let's try that. There we go. Okay. Let's try that.
Sorry about that, folks. Sorry about that housekeeping thing. We usually have that squared away before. Okay, so you say that some people are maybe the main people don't know what they want. I think they know what is true, what is going to happen. They have an idea what they want to happen, especially on the Kiev side. But I think that they know what's going to happen. But there's others who are kind of more ambivalent. It's literally a life and death issue for the Ukraine side, naturally, and it's an existential problem for the Russian side. So that changes the dynamic of what they're willing to do. But there are those in the European side and on the American side that have a lot less constraints, and their eyes are focused on something a little bit different. There was an article in yesterday's Washington Post by General Jacques and Mark Thiessen, who's a Washington Post columnist. And their contention is, hey, America needs to continue to arm Ukraine, but without U.S. taxpayer dollars. So, they're kind of saying, they're talking to Trump here because Trump has said, he doesn't want American taxpayer dollars. He campaigned on that. So many in the right are against that. But he's saying, hey, how's about we keep going with the money, but we just don't make it U.S. taxpayer dollars. We'll see how we get there. But one of the reasons I really wanted to highlight this and to get your view on it, because I think that the premise based on this argument is flawed from the beginning, which is going to make any recommendations flawed as well. But let's get into that first. Here's the first one I want to point out. These two authors argue that they wrote, but regardless of what happens at the negotiating table, the United States will need to provide Ukraine with weapons for many years to come. If Putin resists Trump's peace efforts, the president has promised to increase U.S. military support for Ukraine to force the Russian leader to the negotiating table. Gary, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but let's stop with that first one there. Can Trump force Vladimir Putin to a negotiating table?
No, and Putin said so, by the way. So this is clear that the Russians don't trust the Ukrainians. They want, in fact, there is a say in French. You say, if you want to achieve something, speak to God, not to the saints. And that's exactly the same thing with Trump. He wants to talk to the US and he doesn't trust the Ukrainians. Remember when in the previous agreements, they had agreements between Russia and Ukraine, and eventually the Europeans, the US in particular, came behind them and said, no, this is not valid. So now the Russians have learned from that, and now they don't trust discussing directly with the Ukrainians. They want to talk to the Americans, because at the end of the day, this is the US who has the overall control of the situation, more or less. So at least this is the way the Russians understand that. The Europeans, they are not able to sustain the conflict if the US is not there. That's why now the discussion comes about money, because this is for the Europeans. They don't have, I mean, all the European economies are failing. And I mean, I don't want to go back to this, but the fact of the matter is that so far, and if you look at what happened in the last 2 years, it was mainly a funding provided by Americans. So Europeans cannot afford to do that, and therefore they have to find alternative solutions. And that's the reason why we talk about money. But the name of the game is not the money. The name of the game is what we want to achieve with Ukraine. And that's the whole thing. The problem is that nobody knows on the Western side at large, what do we expect from Ukraine? And that's from the very beginning. Or better said, at the very beginning of the conflict, everybody assumed that with the sanctions, I mean, the combination of the sanctions and the war on the ground, Russia would collapse within weeks. But this didn't happen. And they don't really have a plan B, meaning that Russia doesn't collapse, they continue to fight, but it's just giving an opportunity for Russia to gain more advantage on the ground. But there is no real vision of what do we want to achieve.
Well, and that's why I want to go back to this article. If you could throw that first one back up there again, the second part of that, because it's like one of them seems to be saying, all right, first of all, we're going to force Russia to the negotiating table. But then he envisions, however he is forced to the table, that after peace is achieved, Kiev will need U.S. weapons to deter Russia from resuming hostilities when Trump leaves. So he's assuming that whatever negotiated deal comes out, that the United States / Europe will be able to continue giving weapons and ammunition and everything else to the Ukraine side into perpetuity. But one of the specific goals laid out by the Russian side, by Putin several times, is the neutralization of Ukraine. So do you think that there is any prospect that Russia will allow the U.S. to keep giving them weapons indefinitely?
Well, the problem is that Ukraine is condemned to fight unless it accepts to negotiate at one point. And the thing is that we have now a very peculiar situation in which Ukraine is withdrawing, and there will be one point, and that's exactly what Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, said, that it might be a point where Ukraine doesn't exist anymore. So for Ukraine, they will try to avoid reaching that point. Okay. On the other side, if you look at the Russians, they never planned or wanted to occupy the whole of Ukraine, because they know that the western part of Ukraine will be very hard to keep, because there is a profound anti-Russian mindset in the western part, meaning that the Russians will avoid to go in the western part. So that means there is a point where the Russians will have to stop if they don't want to go in the western part. So there is a point of equilibrium here that needs to be found, both by the Ukrainians and the Russians, because there is a point where the Ukrainians don't want to go back because Ukraine will disappear, and from the other side, there is a point they don't want to go beyond that point, because they will enter an endless war and counter-guerrilla, counter-insurgency type of war against Ukraine. So we need to find a solution. Probably this line is something like the Dnieper River. I don't know if it could be such a line, but there will be a point of equilibrium. The problem is that when we talk about resources, remember that most of the resources of Ukraine are in fact on the eastern part. And we have just seen that the Russians have taken over the largest lithium mine in Europe, in fact.
Mm.
And they are apparently on the verge of taking the largest coal mine of Ukraine.
In the
So
Pokrovsk
meaning
area you're
that,
talking about.
sorry?
In the Pokrovsk area, I think you're talking about.
Yeah,
Is
in
that
the
the one?
Pokrovsk area, absolutely.
Right.
So we are in a situation where if Ukraine wants to stay to remain, it will have to have resources. Now there is the whole issue of Odessa, because if the Russians cut the southern part of Ukraine from the Black Sea, that means that Ukraine will become a landlocked country without agricultural and mineral resources, and it will be very hard to maintain the country afloat. So again, there is a point of equilibrium. And it seems that the Russians are ready, probably not to go on the western part of Ukraine, but they are ready to go on the western bank of the Dnieper River, especially in the Kherson and Odessa region, meaning that they probably have the intent of taking over this spot, which is historically very much linked to the Russian history. I mean, Odessa and Kherson. Remember that Kherson was the place where the Count of Potemkin was buried. His coffin was removed just before the Ukrainian took over the city in October 2022. But that means those two cities, Kherson and Odessa, are very important for the Russians. So they may be tempted to take that, but by doing so, they will completely isolate Ukraine from the Black Sea. And
Right.
that will remove a lot of resources from Ukraine.
Right, and
So,
that's going to be key to what these authors are saying, because it seems that they're not aware of that, or they haven't actually looked at a map. Hard to say. But Gary, if you can go up to that second call out that we had from that article, one of the things I want to highlight here, a couple of things again. It says that the American people have provided 183 billion in aid to Ukraine. This assistance was not charity. Stopping Putin from subjugating Ukraine was and remains in the United States' vital national security interest. Now, let me just ask your opinion right there, because I think that that's probably designed for an audience of one, and probably to the president of the United States, Donald Trump, to make him think that yes, it's in our vital national interest. And by the way, for any of our American audiences who don't know, that's code word for something that we must do or must possess, or we're not safe. Do you believe that if Ukraine falls, whether to the Dnieper or in the current line of contact, that it will affect negatively the vital national interest of the United States?
no, certainly not. But again, there are different opinions, because I've heard, now I don't know if it's Donald Trump himself who said so, or somebody else, I don't remember, but that came out in the last days, that Ukraine was precisely not a vital interest for the US. So you have contradictory meaning on that. And even for the West, by the way, because I mean for the Europe, because at the end of the day, we never helped Ukraine as if it was a vital interest. I mean, if you look at the type of equipment we delivered to Ukraine,
Right, right.
even Zelensky complained about the quality of equipment. Even he refused. I mean, I remember it was a Dutch Leopard tank one, the Leopard 1A5, and the Ukrainians sent them back to Netherlands because these tanks were not fit for action.
Right.
So, and that applied also to a couple of those Leopard 1 provided by Germany. So, meaning that we never acted as if Ukraine was vital for Europe. You know,
Right. And so that's why I get into that second part of that last call out there I had, is because there are some, and listen, we just got to call it what it is. You know, much of this money has been spent right here in the USA. And so they're exposing here that a lot of this money, it's not really to stop Putin from subjugating Ukraine. It's not because of vital American national interest. We just have to be honest. There are those in the West that want the cash flow to come into their pockets. And if anybody's confused on this, one person who's rather not is Volodymyr Zelensky. He said last month, he was asking a question when he was being interviewed by Lex Fridman, and he, I think, mentioned the fact that all this money had been donated to him. But Zelensky said, by the way, about that money.
During all this time of the war, around 177 billion have been voted for or decided upon. 177 billion. Let's be honest. We have not received half of this money. The second point, which is very important, just as an example, is it corruption? The first question, whose corruption? This is the second. As a president, I had cargo jets, and I asked America to give me the opportunity to use our jets for transfer, not to pay a lot. To whom? To your companies, to American companies. No, I didn't get this opportunity.
So, I mean, this has been the case for a while, that a lot of this money, you also may recall during the time in early 2024 when the Democrats administration was complaining to the Republican Congress that they wanted this $61 billion package to pass because they said it was so important to the war effort. And they always highlighted that, yes, but most of this money goes right here in America. And that's, of course, frustrating the Zelensky side, because they see that, a lot of that money's going somewhere else, and while they're trying to fight. But then we get to the point in that article where the authors lay out how they think this can work, how they think this money can actually be appropriated and not hit American taxpayer money. And the first one you'll see there is they said, let Ukraine use frozen Russian assets to buy U.S. weapons. Now, this is two guys who were out of office. One is a Washington Post writer, and the other one is a former military commander, General Jacques. But this apparently is closer to what people in the administration are saying or thinking, as exemplified by General Keith Kellogg.
Let Ukraine use frozen Russian assets to buy U.S. weapons. Is that on the table?
Well, that's a discussion piece. That's always part of it, because you have all these options and you want to present the President of the United States with multitudes of options so he can pick which one he wants to go with. But I think we've always talked about it. We've talked about this repeatedly, of using Russian frozen assets to do that, to buy U.S. arms. I mean, that is one piece of the puzzle that needs to be discussed, and it's going to be on the table with the President to talk about, but it's not the piece that is going to solve this. But it's an interesting point, and it's worth discussing.
So talk to me about the pros and cons of using frozen Russian assets to fund the Ukraine war.
Well, we are facing now, what are we facing in the world today? We're facing a trust crisis between the West and the rest of the world. And if we use those frozen assets, which belong to Russia, there's no question about that. Legally speaking, they belong to Russia. It's money that Russia has given, or not given, but lent to Western countries, because Western countries needed money. So now, if you confiscate that money that was lent by Russia, you will completely destroy the fundamentals of the international financial system. Because look at today. I mean, obviously, for all the projects that Trump has, Stargate with 500 billion, whatever, he will need money. Where does he get this money if it's not with the taxpayer? That means he will have to have loans and bonds to have this money. So people will have to provide money. But if they have the risk of having their fund not only frozen, but confiscated, nobody will lend that money. So,
or if they do, it'll be loaned at a much higher interest rate, which will then start to have real problems on the U.S. economy.
well, possibly, yes, possibly, but probably now, because now you have alternatives. You know, 50 years ago, U.S. was the leading country in the world, and obviously you could trust the U.S., and it was it was kind of an investment, really, to support the U.S. Today, you have alternatives. You can fund China, you can fund Russia, you can fund India, and you are sure that they will not confiscate what you provide to them.
Yeah.
So this is the paradox of this situation, and that applies very much to Europe as well. I mean, Europe will need money France is now evaluating processes to get money and to have issue bonds and things like this in order to fund money. But if the trust is not there, if people don't trust France, they will not have money. So we are in weak position today. All Western economies are in weak position, meaning that we will need money. And that's precisely the moment where we decide to confiscate the money that was
it's a situation where you got this greedy hand, and it's like, boy, it's right there. We have the power without thinking about what comes next. And speaking of what comes next, the second one on there, Gary, if you can put that back up, the second recommendation they had, and you've spoken to this a little bit already, is they said, hey, how's about we give loans to Ukraine based on the natural resources of Ukraine. So the idea is that basically, and look, let's just, again, call this what it is. This is like, we're going to rape your country and get all of your stuff, and you're going to owe us. And if anybody has any doubts about that, besides just these two authors, we had one of Trump's biggest allies in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, not long ago said this.
Ukraine is still standing. This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. We can make money and have an economic relationship with Ukraine that'd be very beneficial to us with peace. So Donald Trump's going to do a deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals.
Wow. I mean, he just says it out loud. We're going to enrich ourselves by taking rare earth minerals in this other country who's at war right now. You talk about trust. Does that further erode trust in the I guess, the intentions of the United States?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the fact that, and you showed the video of Zelensky. Even Antony Blinken, that was last year, I think, at the beginning of last year, he said that 90% of what the US has provided to Ukraine has come back to the US. 90%. Meaning that we to some extent, we help ourselves by helping Ukraine, And what Zelensky said, in a certain sense, is correct. The problem is that Zelensky is doubling down with the problem, because he knows that there is a problem. He knows that there is no money. He knows that the West, when it was not in a position to help him as they promised, because remember, in April 2022, as Ukraine had signed the Istanbul Agreement, he was asked to withdraw his signature. And that's what Zelensky did. It withdrew its signature there. So he renounced to the agreement in exchange of support for as long as it takes. Now, what means as long as it takes? I mean, what does it mean in terms of time. Nobody knows that. But that means that in the mind of Zelensky, and I can understand that, he was considering that the help he would receive from the West was unlimited, because it's as long as it takes. That means as long as we cannot defeat Russia, I will get the support. Now, the West is not fulfilling its promise. Let's be honest. The West has promised things it was not in a position to hold. So we are in a very peculiar situation at this stage, and I think it demonstrates the profound dishonesty of the European, the Western leadership at large, U.S. and the Europeans. And that's probably the reason why Donald Trump wants to withdraw from this conflict, because he has understood rightly that this is a black hole. You just pour money into the hole and that disappears.
Right,
and
right.
Nobody takes advantage of that.
And
Probably some corrupt individuals, as we have seen recently. You have this crackdown on corrupt officials everywhere in Ukraine, but there are probably others.
oh yeah,
Zelensky's
you
probably
can be
right.
sure of that. And
So-
I want to kind of highlight something here related. You talk about the comment that we had made a lot of times was, we're going to support you for as long as it takes. And even though Biden's gone and that was his mantra, plenty in the European Union are still saying the same things as recently as yesterday. But let me show you something here on the map that is going to make that difficult. So what you see right here is Velika Novoselica. It's kind of in the southern part of the Eastern Front. And I think it really represents just how dire the situation is for the Ukrainian side. The question is, can their military hang on for as long as it takes and remain a viable military force? We have seen, Colonel, in just the last week, an admission by the Ukrainian side where the General Syrskyi admitted that they are not receiving enough through forced mobilization to offset combat losses. So that means that they are net every day shrinking in capacity. And as well, and you and I have talked about this many times before, the losses that they have every time they get a chance to increase the combat experience, those people are killed off, and then they bring in a whole brand new batch that have no combat experience and very little motivation and morale. Part of the reason for that is you can see on the screen here. This is Velika Novoselica, and this dark red area here represents just the last 12 to 24 hours of an advancement. And now then you see already the Ukraine military that had been defending the city is cut in two. So all these guys down here, we don't know for sure how many, could be up to a brigade, are surrounded. They are now faced with, they will either fight to the death or be captured. That's all they have. These guys here are still fighting. But you see, Russians are north of that, they're south of that, and they're continuing to move even around the flanks and now moving up directly in the heart of the city. This is something that the Ukraine side has done repeatedly throughout this war, is they have stayed beyond the military utility of any particular point. And instead of going back, say, to these areas where they have defensive positions dug back in here in depth, if they had withdrawn these troops back to this point here, now then for Russia to get up in there, they have to come across open fields, and it's a lot easier to attack the Russians than it is when they're literally coming from 5 meters away from the house next to it. So they can continue to go up through here. And there's just no way, because Russia has the numbers, they have the ammunition, they have the drones, the glide bombs, they have everything, artillery, etc. And yet the Ukraine side just will not give up this tenet to hang on to every single house until it's forced out of their dead hands. How do you see this tendency affecting all the rest of the Eastern Front here, especially up in the Pokrovsk area?
Well, in fact, this is not new. I have studied, when I was in NATO in 2014, I studied the various battles that you had between the insurgents, because you had insurgents on the Donbass, not just the Donbass, by the way, but in particular in the Donbass. And you had exactly the same thing. The various defeat of the Ukrainians in the Baltsevo, in There's another one, I don't have the name now, but all the defeat they had was exactly on the same pattern. The Russian or Russian speaking, and they were led by people who had made their military service and military school in the Soviet Union. These were the guys who led the insurgent in 2014. And these guys, they made exactly what we are witnessing today. They use the principle in the Russian, they call that the flowing water. It means where if you have water flowing along a plain, it will avoid all the obstacles. It will just flow around the obstacles. That's exactly the way the Russians understand the operational art. So they will avoid getting stuck into a city. They will flow around it as much as they can, and that's the best way to avoid casualties. And then they will encircle, and it's exactly now what you're seeing in the Donbass area. And what we see with that, it's the inability of the Ukrainians to have an operational concept. As I wrote in my books, the Ukrainians have a tactical approach of the battlefield. The Russians have an operational approach to the battlefield, which is completely different. The Ukrainians will small fights. The Russians will win battles. And in the idea, in the concept of the Russian doctrine, you win battles in order to achieve a strategic objective. So you will, in fact, convert your operational successes into strategic successes, and that's what the Russians will try to do. Now, in terms of personnel, what happens with the Ukrainians is that those guys who are encircled now, they say exactly what we had previously in other parts of the battlefront last year and in 2023, that people feel abandoned. And they say, well, we were just abandoned by the high command. And that contributes to the very low morale of the armed forces. And then we are back to what we said before, because what happens today? As you know, I'm now working on the covert activities and clandestine activities, or resistance activity, if you want, on both sides. And now what we see on the Ukrainian territory, I mean the territory which is still under the control of Kiev, is that you have resistance movement, but different resistance movement. You have Ukrainian resistance movement who are struggling against the regime and against forced recruitment. And you have Russian movements who are supporting, in fact, the Russians by providing intelligence to locate headquarters and to disrupt logistics and things like this. So exactly the kind of clandestine operation you had prior to D-Day in France in 1944, exactly the same thing. But the interesting thing is that now you have those Ukrainians movement fighting against the regime of Zelensky. So they're Ukrainians, they're not Russians. They are exchanging information and weapons with the Russians, the clandestine groups. And you have, and that's probably, that explains also the crackdown that you have right now. I think 2 days ago, the Ukrainian government announced like 1,000 raids across Ukraine to find weapons cache and things like this. The problem is that the Ukrainian army is providing weapons to the Russian resistance on Ukrainian territory. So that means that the whole issue of abandoning soldiers on the battlefront, not providing enough weapons, not providing enough support, standing them into desperate situations, constraining them to fight up to the last fighters, all that creates a sentiment within the Ukrainian army, which is a very extremely negative. You have a very low morale, and therefore they tend to fraternize. I don't know if the word is English, but to have kind of fraternalization
Yeah.
with the Russians, and even with the Russians who are on the territory controlled by Kiev to make the resistance. So we are very close to a point where you will have a complete breakdown of the whole, I would say, Ukraine. So not just a military breakdown, but a political, societal breakdown. And that's probably the point that the Russians are looking for, because
right. And
this,
in fact, that's exactly where I wanted to go next, because we talked a little bit about, in fact, we had a show earlier today where we showed a number of comments from a recent interview with President Trump about what he's thinking about the negotiations. And people can go and watch it. It's on our archive list there. I recommend people doing that. So I won't repeat it here now. But what I do want to say is that Trump is basically saying, some of the things we've mentioned a little bit of, that he wants a negotiated settlement. He wants to, have some kind of fair deal, which, interestingly enough, by the way, he has never articulated in public what the terms of the deal he wants to have is. But now then, I want to take a look, because these are some comments from today from Vladimir Putin. So that Trump was 2 days ago, but today Putin was addressing some of those things. And one of the first things, interestingly enough, he seems to have agreed with Trump on this one point.
If he had been the president, if the victory wasn't stolen from him in 2020, maybe the Ukrainian crisis that arose in 2022 would have never appeared.
So that's interesting, because that's what Trump is saying. Trump is saying, if I had been, he mentioned that many times. He said, if I'd have been the president, then there would never have been a war, because I would never have allowed it. I had a deal to negotiate. And my thought here, and I like your view on this here, is that Putin is probably speaking more to Trump than to just his own media there. Because I think he's trying to say, yeah, you're right, Mr. Trump. If you'd have been able to negotiate a deal, and we'd have had this war over with. How do you see that comment?
Well, I tend to disagree, because the thing is that the whole thing, what happened on the 24th of February 2022, is that Vladimir Putin tried to implement by force the Minsk agreement. In fact, this is that. There are other background issues, like the problem of neutrality, or NATO getting closer to the Russian border and all that. This is true. This is more in the background. But the reason, the very fact that led Russia to intervene in February 2022 was, in fact, the implementation of the Minsk agreement. And the Minsk agreement was signed in 2015. So Trump, as he came into power in 2017, had all opportunities to have this agreement implemented, but he didn't do that. He didn't do that. Neither Obama before, nor Trump, nor Biden. So this is what led to the confrontation. The issue of NATO would still be on the table, but the Russians always had in mind to solve this issue diplomatically. And that's what they tried, by the way, in 2021, when they sent proposal to both NATO and the US to rethink the whole European security architecture, and to rethink the issue of course, Ukraine, but not just Ukraine, because also an issue with Georgia being part of NATO. But that requires a completely reshuffle of the concept, the very concept of the European security, or the security on the European continent, let's say. Because what we have, NATO, as we know today, is in fact exactly the same NATO we had in 1949. You know, it's based exactly on the same idea, same
Yeah.
concept. I mean, weapons have been modernized, and you have more participants and members, allies. This is true. But the fundament of NATO is still the same. And that's precisely what has led NATO to get closer to
Right.
to Russia.
And so, in that same conversation, the next question that was asked of Putin was, do you think you can have a negotiated settlement? Can you get along with Trump? Here's how he said. Here's how he answered.
I'd like to say that Russia never refused to come into contact with the United States administration. And it is through no fault of ours that the previous administration refused to communicate. I always had business-like relations with the previous US president that were very business-like and pragmatic. But there was trust as well.
You'd mentioned trust a little earlier. He seems to imply that he had at least some level of trust with Trump. So it sounds like, at least conceptually, Putin is willing to say, hey, if we can achieve our goals with diplomacy, we'll do that, and we'll have to wait and see how Trump is. How do you see that?
Well, the problem is that I think what we had in mind, all of us, I think, is before Trump was in his office, was that Trump wanted a negotiation. Now, what we have now is that Trump doesn't want to negotiate. It just says to Vladimir Putin, find a solution, otherwise I will be forced to apply new tariffs, sanctions, and taxes. You know, and he said almost the same thing to Zelensky, saying, find a solution, otherwise I don't send weapons. This is not a negotiation. And I think probably the Russians had in mind that as soon as Trump would come into office, you would have a process that starts. People go sit, as they sit around a table, they put all the problem on the table, and they find a go around for this situation. But it's apparently not what Trump has started. And that, I think, is a source of concern. I think for the Russians and probably for others as well, and probably for the Ukrainians as well, because in fact we are exactly to the point we had few 2 years ago or 7 months ago. I mean, we are back to square one. There is no negotiation. Trump just tried to force people to find a solution. But the idea, I mean, as I understood it before, was that Trump would come up with solutions. And you remember there was all this discussion about peacekeepers and having a frozen line and a demarcation zone. Okay, these solutions were not acceptable for the Russians, but at least it's a step forward into negotiating something. Negotiating something is that one party starts from A, the other starts from B, and you progress on both sides, and at the end you make an agreement on point C. But what we have now is not exactly that. This is just the US is just trying to force others to find a solution. In fact, it's trying to force people to stop fighting.
And it's interesting that headline that Gary was showing just a second there in the Wall Street Journal, where that's U.S. media, and they're recognizing that, listen, that Russia is just brushing off these threats. I've actually found it interesting that they didn't exhibit a lot of bravado. They didn't say they were insulted because of this. They just said, you know what? I mean, we can just keep fighting. That's what the subhead of that one, the Wall Street Journal piece that Gary tossed up there a second ago says. Moscow believes it has the resources and manpower to keep up the fight. That was on U.S. media. I believe it was earlier today on Russian media. They had a similar view on that. And this is on an analysis in the, it's called the Military Review. You may be familiar with it in the Russian media. And they're analyzing what Trump had said, some of these comments. And this analyst inside this article in Russia says, for Putin, the true goal is to secure a friendly Ukraine, which basically means a denazified and demilitarized Ukraine. And he believes that the goal can be achieved sooner or later, regardless of U.S. policy. Peace for Putin is just a means to achieve a goal faster and cheaper. A peace agreement on Russian terms would save significant resources, but, and this is the key, without such an agreement, Putin is willing to fight for as long as it takes to win by force of arms. So this, I think, underscores the, I guess, the entry point for the Russian side. And this is kind of what I'd like your view on here. Is it seems that Russia is willing to talk. There's Putin again today saying, yes, I'm willing to have a discussion with him. Trump has shown he's pragmatic. We're willing to do that. But they have a resourced plan. And you talked about Patrushev recently. He said, you know, that Ukraine may cease to exist in 2025. You had Belyusov, the defense minister, saying we have a resource plan to win in 2025. He's not even talking about negotiations. And so it appears that Trump has to come to the realization, and that means Kiev, and that also means Brussels, that if we don't have some kind of concessions, and probably pretty major concessions from what we have in our mind, then Russia's simply going to say, okay, fine, and just roll over until they take all by force. How can that work out? And is that a problem for the West?
Well, the problem is that I think Trump had a simplified understanding of the problem, or he didn't see the problem in all its complexity. And that was reflected in some comments he made. And the issue is that obviously what he didn't get is that for Vladimir Putin, for the Russians, there's an existential aspect of this. And this existential aspect has two layers, if you want. The first layer is about the population of the Russian population of Ukraine. And that's the rationale for the Minsk agreement, and the breach of these agreements were in fact what led Russians to intervene. The second layer of existential problem for Russia is the issue of Ukraine being part of NATO or not. And here it's also interesting to see that Zelensky said, or it was said, Zelensky said in March 2022 that as he asked Obama whether he will be member of NATO or not, the reply was, and that was reported by CNN in probably 22nd March of 2022 or something like that. In any case, the reply was, Ukraine will not be part of NATO, but in public, we'll say that the door remains open. So Zelensky knows perfectly since March 2022, and I think he said that at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He said that the West doesn't want us in NATO, and that's a fact. We know that nobody wants Ukraine in NATO because it causes so much problem. And by the way, as explained Alexei Arestovich in March 2018, 19, sorry, the idea of provoking, and again, we always use the word unprovoked for Ukraine, but the idea of provoking Russia to enter Ukraine was because the West and the Americans in particular were convinced that Russia was so weak that it could be defeated just by the combination of sanctions and the war on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what prompted Ukraine to provoke this offensive, or to create this offensive in the Donbass in February 2022, that in fact prompted the reaction of Russia. So that was calculated, that has been perfectly described 3 years in advance by Alexei Arestovich. He even gave the date. He said this will happen end of 2021, beginning of 2022. So we knew that perfectly. Now, the thing is that this is, the Ukrainians knew that otherwise they would never be member of NATO. And since they are defeated since February 2022, they are guaranteed not to be in NATO. So why does the West, in particular the US, continue to float this idea that Ukraine could be member of NATO? We know that will not happen.
No.
And you have more and more even NATO members who said that would not be a wise idea. So and that's exactly why Zelensky continues, or thinks that he needs to continue fighting, because he feels that there is still a possibility that he could meet the condition to be member of NATO.
But you think he does know? Because I mean, whatever he's being told, whatever the public statements are by NATO, he's got to know. There's no way he's coming in, especially now. So it would seem pretty irrational to go down that path and to keep your country fighting and dying for an unattainable goal.
Yes, but listen to the Europeans. The Europeans are saying, of still floating this idea. Mark Rutte just said it a couple of days ago. So they're still floating this idea. Even if the Americans, NATO is essentially a US organization, basically, because I have been 5 years in NATO, you feel that when a decision is taken, if it's not approved by the US, just forget about it. This is, and for a good reason. This is not even a criticism. This is the way NATO was built. NATO was built around the US nuclear power. This is that. Yeah. So that means, in essence, NATO is the fact that all European countries get under the US nuclear umbrella. So US is a primus inter pares in there. So they decide who will or will not. So
and again, though, I don't think anybody should at this point be under any illusions, other than what you just said, that they will never come into NATO. NATO would never, tie themselves to this volatile situation here that could draw them into a war that they will otherwise never fight. But he still is. But anyway, I guess we'll have to wait and see how it's going to happen. We should be, just any day now, we should hear something about when there's going to be the first meeting between, whether it's the envoys or whether it's at the presidential level. There's a phone call, et cetera. And we'll be watching with great interest to see what things are coming out and where this is going to go from there. So in the meantime, I really appreciate you illuminating these issues today so that we at least know what the conditions are heading into those talks.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. We appreciate it. We appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that. That helps our channel out a lot more and gives other people an opportunity to see the same high quality shows that you do here. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.